In the early days of psychology, mental disorders were grouped in two broad categories. One was neurosis and the other was psychosis. While in neurosis there was a serious disruption of one's normal everyday life, in psychosis the disruption was very, very severe. In most cases of neurosis, people could go themselves to the psychologist and get treatment. Whereas in psychosis, most cases were referred by others and required hospitalization as well as medications being force-fed on occasions. There was a very clear difference between these two categories. I would say that even though these categories aren't used that much today, that of neurosis and psychosis, the general grouping tends to be around the same. So for instance, disorders like anxiety, depression, phobias, somatoform disorders, dissociative disorders constitute the bulk of what the psychologists treat on a daily basis. Whereas more severe impairment of personality, such as psychosis, a lot of the times required hospitalization until very recently. In the last few decades, we have community-based models of psychosis management. But before we get into that, first let's talk about the common everyday so-called neurotic problems of the mind. The first and the foremost among them is anxiety. Now, we all understand anxiety as a corollary of worry. There is something important before us, like an exam or a project with a deadline. There could be a paper whose deadline is due. There could be work given to us by our boss that has to be finished by a certain deadline. There could be financial problems at home and we don't know what's going to happen next, so on and so forth. These are problems that usually are linked to anxiety. As you can see, that there is a lot of thought process. There's a lot of thinking that goes into worrying. But the result is an uncomfortable feeling in the body. Now, if you think about it, anxiety is like fear. You encounter a snake, you feel afraid, you either attack it or you run away from it. But an exam, you can neither attack nor run away from. You need to prepare for it in silence. And that is why anxiety is such a normal part of our normal everyday existence. Research has shown that some anxiety is in fact useful. Research has shown that many of us wouldn't even prepare for the exams if there wasn't some amount of anxiety. The only problem is that when anxiety crosses a threshold, it can be crippling and it can make the work that we need to do difficult. Here we say that anxiety has become dysfunctional. And it is only when the anxiety becomes dysfunctional that we treat it as a disorder. Let's look at depression. You feel sad over something. There is nothing wrong with feeling sad at the death of somebody, at the loss of somebody near to you. There is no real harm in feeling sad if you haven't been able to achieve an objective in your life, and so on and so forth. But the problem is when this sadness makes you dysfunctional, when you feel demotivated and when you feel that you cannot even get up to go to work, or cannot even shower in the morning, or cannot even shave, or cannot even dress up to go to an occasion. You feel lethargic, you feel unmotivated, you feel like you can't go on. But the important thing here is to understand that it's not just feeling like this that is the criterion for dysfunction. It is actually doing it, or rather not doing it, that is the problem. So for instance, you feel like you don't want to get up to go to work, but you actually get up and go to work. You feel like not attending this wedding, but you get up and you say, well, no, it is a very important relationship. I need to go to my cousin's wedding, and you get up, and even though you don't feel like it, you go and you participate. And nobody else can even notice that you're feeling sad. So that is not depression. Depression is when you don't go to the wedding. Depression is when you don't go to work. Unfortunately, people have started to talk about sadness as if it is depression. Anyway, another very common problem, not as common as anxiety and depression, is what we call somatoform disorders. And somatoform disorders are generally more common in the third world countries where there isn't much awareness about psychological difficulty. So what happens is that instead of a psychological expression of our problems, we feel bodily symptoms. So somebody has a backache, somebody has a fever, somebody has an illness that cannot be diagnosed. Mostly in these cases, we find that doctors are unable to diagnose the organic or the biological cause of the disease, in which case these people are referred to psychologists. So what seems to happen is that the psychological stress on us expresses itself as a physical symptom. Sometimes it happens that these are symbolically expressed. That's not my opinion. Psychodynamic psychotherapists tend to propose that they are sometimes symbolic in nature. For instance, somebody feels that the burden is too much. The psychological burden is too much. So their shoulders and their backs tend to be affected. Somebody feels that they can't go on. So they might feel a certain difficulty or certain pain in their knees or in their legs, actually preventing them from going on physically. So these are some examples of what used to be called neurotic disorders. When we talk about psychotic disorders, these usually mean severe impairment of everyday life. So you can see that how a person who's anxious about making a presentation in the classroom is actually still going to the classroom. They may be sweating, they may be palpitating, they may be doing all sorts of things, but they're still going to the classroom and participating. Whereas somebody with psychosis usually experiences severe delusions and hallucinations at times. So for instance, they're sitting at home and they might feel they're in the classroom and they're talking to themselves, but they think that they're actually talking to their teacher. And then they would switch to a situation where they might be on the beach having a conversation. And with time, this kind of situation gets worse if it is not treated promptly. And that is why we say that early intervention in psychosis can be very, very helpful. I remember a client who was brought to me only 2 months after the onset of psychosis. I was able to help the individual because it had only been 2 months. A lot of the times, unfortunately, psychotic patients are brought to us years after the problem starts, in which case the prognosis is very poor and psychotic illnesses cannot then be treated successfully. So mainly in psychotic categories, we have things like psychotic depression, where the intensity of depression is much more severe. People become catatonic, they become rigid, they are unable to move. Many people become very, very suicidal, and it is very difficult to contain them in that kind of a situation. Similarly, some people can become very, very manic, and this manic behavior can be very severe. It's like, a person reported that his wife just left home and came home after 5 days, and she was going around town walking barefoot because she felt so energetic that she could do anything, and she didn't feel any concern for her security or safety. So manic episodes can be like that. You find another very, very severe impairment. Another manifestation of mania would be extreme overspending. So somebody who, let's say, has a saving of 100,000 rupees goes out and spends the entire 100,000 rupees on shopping for clothes in one day. So that's an example of severe impairment of personality. So this is a broad introduction to the kind of disorders psychologists are faced with in their clinical practice on a day-to-day basis.